I support the Jewish state of Israel. They have been in that land. That is their land.
That was vintage, Alex, but his propaganda didn't stop.
And Ahmadinejad say we want to blow Israel off the map. And by the way, he has basically said that.
No, Ahmadinejad did not say that. He talked about wiping out the Zionist regime from the pages of history, much like the Soviet Union. Zionism is a political ideology, not a physical location. And the Soviet Union was wiped off the map, but Russia is still there. All the satellite states are still there. They're not talking about genocide or annihilation. They're talking about ending a brutal apartheid regime.
Why did they start firing rockets in early October?
Because Israel was killing kids back in October too. In fact, they killed 75 people in Gaza throughout the year before this most recent conflict, as well as 5 people in the West Bank.
And why does everybody, because again, I'm about logic. I'm about being fair here. And I see a lot of stuff done in Israel I don't like. I see a lot of stuff a lot of other places I don't like. My only issue is I don't understand why Hamas is doing this.
I love how Alex doesn't take the context into account that there is an ongoing blockade there, as well as racial colonization in the West Bank. The occupation and the blockade don't count, apparently. Why would anybody resist something like that? No, that's removed. He will not inform his listeners about any of it. About the property annexed between the Green Line and the apartheid wall.
You talking about building a wall on the border?
In the West Bank. Or the Blue Line in the north, or the new buffer zone in Gaza, and the blockade blocking food, and the routine murders and slaughters. He didn't tell his viewers anything about the Israelis shooting kids from helicopters and coming in with giant bulldozers and tanks and shooting more people, or gunning up a funeral. All of that's missing from the narrative. It's just Hamas is firing missiles, not rockets, missiles, into Israel, and Israel is responding, and it's just some even-handed conflict, and he's trying to be neutral. When you take a struggle that is not neutral at all whatsoever and try to balance it in the middle, that's not neutrality. That's deception.
Over there, they want to have the kids in school so they can go on the news and say, look at the...
No, that's true. They actually park the schools right next to the missiles.
Really? They park schools next to missiles? That's a double lie. I think he misspoke there. Maybe he meant to say they park the missiles next to the schools, but whatever. It's not missiles. They don't have their own propulsion system and guidance or anything. These are rockets, homemade. They're really like shot out of a tube type rockets. They're hardly doing any damage whatsoever. This is something, an act by the desperate. And they're not parking them next to schools. If you look at the civilian death tolls, where whole families are wiped out in their homes, they're not put in the line of fire. Israel has bombed bedrooms. They've bombed houses. And they do have guided missiles. And they do have strategic weapons. They've bombed chicken farms. They bombed the media outlets. They bombed specific targets to destroy infrastructure and kill civilians and wipe out any possible alternate media from what they wanted on their official propaganda on ABC and NBC, CBS, Fox, BBC. They blew up the tower at RT. They attacked the New York Times. That's not an accident. When they wipe these kids out, these aren't human shields. They're blowing up residential homes. At the very end of Cast Lead, they took out most of the agricultural farming. Why? Because they wiped out their food, and then they put a blockade against imports. And why aren't they firing from their military bases? Because they don't have any military bases. This is a bunch of militia group civilians fighting a modern military army paid for by U.S. tax dollars and donations from Zionist Christian holy roller churches, most of which is gathered in ignorance. People think the money is going to help the poor. In fact, it goes to butcher people or to go dig up diamonds for Pat Robertson in Africa. Total ignorance. None of that is on DisinfoWars. He omits it. Just acts like there's missiles and this is just so even and he doesn't want anyone to die. Well, great, and I believe that. He doesn't want anyone to die. But he's completely ignorant of the situation when he cannot mention the occupation or the blockade or the routine slaughter of Gaza by the Israelis.
Ahmadinejad is saying, blow up Israel, wipe them off the face. So,
again, he did not say that, and even if he did, it's Israel that is actually physically wiping people off the map. That's not just something someone said. That's what they're saying and doing. Furthermore, Ahmadinejad is not the leader of Iran. He doesn't control the military. He is a figurehead. The president has no control over the army. The Ayatollah does. The Ayatollah has said that nuclear weapons are un-Islamic. We all know they're not really seeking to build a nuclear bomb, and they are not seeking to wipe Israel off the map. That is a lie. That is thick propaganda, just like the lies from the same Zionist cabals that fed us the baloney about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, anthrax, mobile labs, chemicals under the palaces, etc., etc. They're lying. It's deception, just like Jonestown. And it was Zionist cabals, the OSP and the neocons. They have names, Feith and Pearl and Libby and Wolfowitz. It wasn't satanic, Luciferian, blood-drinking Bavarian death cults. It was a cabal of neoconservative Zionists in our own Defense Department that led to the war in Iraq, which Alex makes no connection to whatsoever either.
The globalists are eugenicists. They are Luciferian Satanists.
He just vaguely says Cheney and Rumsfeld, Bush is a puppet, blah, 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 New World Order, blah, blah, blah. Never gives you the names, never tells you the specific lies and their origins, and makes any sense out of any of it. He just likes to say CIA and MI6 all grouped together and some vague path to nowhere. The man is disinformation and an apologist for the Zionist state of Israel.
And there's about 6 million Jewish people in the Middle East. There's 600 million Arabs and Muslims. It's 100-to-1 ratio, and the land is 1,000-to-1. If you look at the Muslim and Arab land,
I know those numbers. My only issue is this. I have had groups connected to the Israel lobby attack me because I'm against the whole globalist move because all these governments are lined up for it. But then I separately, viciously, and sustained, before I ever even got into these issues, have been attacked by groups that all they do is obsess on Israel. If someone falls on a banana peel, it's Israel's fault. Everyone that works for me supposedly works for Israel. I get orders from Israel, all of it totally made up. They'll even edit that together. It's like, I've never seen so much deception. Is my point, is that I'm not somebody that's a joiner or in this camp or that camp, and it just must be really weird if you're Jewish or especially Israeli to have the whole world 24/7 obsessed with you when, like you said, you're 1% over there in that area. I mean, it is biblical. It is.
This is the kind of mentality that a Zionist, which the Israeli caller named David has, where they think of land in terms of race. It's one and the same. And there's very small amount of land for the chosen race of God, his race, the Jewish race, and yet the Arabs occupy all this other territory. And so they're much bigger and they have more people, so tiny Israel must be on the defense. They can't be the colonizers. I guess the United Kingdom couldn't be the colonizers either because they're on a little island and look at all the other places they destroyed and ravaged. I like to make the analogy of South Africa. White South African apartheid. Oh, look at how big the rest of Africa is and all the black people. Why don't they just move and go live over there? And Alex has said this crap too. He says, we look at Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and he starts naming all the Arab states. He said, they won't take the Palestinians.
That the other Arab countries won't let the Palestinians into their countries.
It's not up to them to take the Palestinians. The Palestinians shouldn't have to leave. Why can't people live together on the same piece of dirt? Why does it have to be exclusively for the chosen race of God? When has Alex ever brought up the policy of racial colonization where Israel builds settlements for Jews and Jews only, which is racial supremacism to the same peak of Nazism or any other form of racial supremacy? Never talks about it. Why? He'll talk about other crimes. He'll talk about some stuff that it's not even real. He'll talk about biblical prophecy and demons and stuff sometimes, but he won't point out the very real process of the settlements and the demolition of homes and building racially segregated cities on top of land that was taken by force. You want to talk about a police state? There you go. But he doesn't mention it because Alex likes his shekels, and Alex has a dream of one day being in Hollywood, which of course he also accused of being owned by the Arabs.
Hollywood is owned by the Arabs.
I'm just saying, I know in the Arab world, demonization of Israel becomes just an easy one-off for everything. Because I personally have experienced it, because I don't even hardly get into Israel and all this. I try to stay out of it, and people demand to put you in a camp is what I'm saying.
Now here's a fair point, because there are factions who blame everything on the Jews, and they are very vocal online, and they probably have attacked Alex Jones, sort of the right thing for the wrong reason. But that is a straw man, because it's not either or. It's not apologize for Israel or have this fake neutrality in a conflict that isn't neutral whatsoever, or blame every single problem on the Jews. You cannot conflate Zionism and Judaism or Jewishness. They are not the same. It's very clear. I've got a bunch of videos about that. But because those factions are out there that criticize Alex Jones, is no excuse for his apologetic behavior and his omission about information on the criminal state of Israel and how strongly the lobby and the Israelis control U.S. foreign policy. Why did we go to war with Iraq? Who gave us the lies? It wasn't Luciferians. It wasn't the Jesuits. It wasn't the Illuminati. It was the Office of Special Plans, which has real people with real names and real ideology tied to Israel for Israeli interests. The anthrax lie about 9/11 connected Saddam Hussein and Muhammad Atta. Who gave us that? That came from the Peanut Cabal, from Gary Schmidt and James Woolsey. It was reiterated by Robert Kagan and William Crystal. And they said at that meeting in Prague, and that made the connection to the war in Iraq, which gave us the 1441 resolution they said wasn't being enforced, even though it was, because they didn't really have weapons of mass destruction. And it was Louis Levy and his girlfriend Judith Miller who gave us the lies about the mobile labs, etc., etc. It wasn't the devil. It was real people, and they were Zionists, and we went to war in Iraq for Israel. And the propaganda for Iran is not coming from oil companies. It's not coming from Bavarians. It's coming from Israelis. It's Netanyahu who is leading the warpath on Iran. It's the Israelis using MEK to assassinate scientists. And it's the U.S. and Israel that made Stuxnet to attack reactors in Iran. The U.S. does not benefit with a war in Iran at all. The U.S. does not benefit with blocking Iran from having nuclear energy at all. And they certainly don't benefit from sanctions that prevent the U.S. from buying oil from Iran at all. These are Israeli lies and for Israeli interests. But Alex dodges the Israeli question like a man on the Matrix dodging bullets, who goes through all these big loop around. He blames the revolution in Egypt on the CIA. Millions of people in the street. Couldn't possibly be a legit revolution against a dictator. And then the Muslim Brotherhood got in there because they had support from Qatar and because they had the organizational capacity to fill in the vacuum, and the people are still fighting with them today too. But no, he just says CIA does everything. Assad doesn't do anything. Israel can't do anything wrong. They're protecting themselves from missiles, according to Alex Kosher Jonestown.
This is my biggest criticism of Israel. The Israel lobby consistently is anti-Second Amendment in this country, while my taxpayer money pays for settlers' M16s. And I mean, my goodness, I'm going to pay for your M16s, but I can't have one? You know, that's my issue.
And that is his biggest criticism of Israel. AIPAC is anti-gun, but his money has to buy M16s for the Israelis. Oh, really? Your greatest criticism of Israel is their lobby is anti-gun. Yes, their lobby is anti-gun in the U.S. and pro-gun in Israel. That's the smallest hypocrisy you could admit, the only nugget you could say. I know you're aware of the other things. It couldn't possibly be a criticism of, I don't know, demolishing people's homes, shooting kids, dumping depleted uranium on children and white phosphorus and MK77. Now I know you got forced to report that back during Cast Lead, but not without sandwiching it between a bunch of but excuses. Israel drug us to war in Iraq. They've got propaganda about Iran. If you really want to prevent war in the Middle East, you can't only just talk about the Salafi jihadists and Al-Qaeda that the U.S. is supporting. You also have to talk about the other religious extremists that the U.S. is supporting, and that's the Jewish supremacists in Israel, and they are not defending themselves. They are on the offense. I don't know how bombing places can be considered defense. If bombing something is defense, what the hell is offense?
The Jewish state of Israel. They have been in that land. That is their land.